What if I told you there's a road that passes through hell itself, and once you're on it, there's only one rule: don't pull over, no matter what you see. I wish someone had told me that before I took the wrong turn. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. A straight shot down the interstate to visit an old friend I hadn't seen in years. I had the route memorized, the car packed, and a playlist loaded up for the drive. It was late, the sky a deep, inky black with no moon in sight, and the road ahead stretched out like a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. I was making good time, cruising along at a steady pace, when my GPS pinged, telling me to take the next exit. I glanced at the screen, frowning. I didn't remember there being an exit here, and the road didn't look familiar, but I figured it was just a detour, construction maybe, or an accident blocking the main route. I trusted the GPS, so I took the turn, the tires humming as they hit the rougher pavement of the off-ramp. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars, and it wound through a thick forest that loomed on either side, the trees pressing in like dark sentinels. The headlights barely cut through the fog that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, and the further I drove, the more the unease settled in my gut. Fucking GPS, I muttered, glancing at the screen again. But the map was blank, the little blue dot showing me in the middle of nowhere, with no roads or landmarks in sight. I should have turned back then, should have found my way back to the interstate. But I was tired, and the thought of backtracking seemed like a hassle, so I kept going, figuring the road had to lead somewhere eventually. The minutes ticked by, the road winding deeper into the forest, the trees growing taller, thicker, until they blocked out even the faintest hint of starlight. The fog was so dense now that I could barely see a few feet ahead, the headlights casting eerie shadows that twisted and danced on the pavement. I was about to pull over to get my bearings when I saw something up ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road, just barely visible in the fog. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, trying to make out who it was. They were tall, dressed in dark clothing, their head down, hair obscuring their face. Shit, I muttered, my heart skipping a beat. My first thought was that they'd broken down, that they needed help. But as I got closer, something about the way they stood, so still, so silent, made my skin crawl. I rolled down the window, leaning out slightly. Hey, do you need... Before I could finish, they lifted their head, and I saw their face. Or rather, what was left of it. The skin was peeling away, revealing raw, bloody muscle and bone beneath, their eyes hollow sockets that stared back at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as I sped past them, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't dare check the rearview mirror. I just kept driving, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. What the fuck? What the fuck? I whispered, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. But the road didn't end. It just kept going, winding through the fog and the trees, twisting and turning like some goddamn maze. And then, up ahead, I saw another figure, and another, and another. They were everywhere, standing by the side of the road, watching me with those same hollow eyes, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of decay and pain. Some of them were missing limbs, others had gaping wounds that oozed black, tar-like blood. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, waiting. I sped up, my pulse racing. But no matter how fast I went, the road didn't end. The figures just kept coming, appearing out of the fog like phantoms, their numbers growing with every mile. And then, I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road, right in my path. A young woman with long, dark hair and a white dress that was stained with blood. Her head was tilted to the side, her eyes wide and pleading, her mouth moving as if she were whispering something. I swerved to avoid her, the car skidding on the wet pavement, but as I passed her, she turned her head to follow me, her eyes locking onto mine.
Help me,
She mouthed, her voice echoing in my head, though I hadn't heard a sound. I nearly lost control of the car, the tires screeching as I fought to keep it on the road. But as soon as I regained control, I floored it, the engine roaring as I pushed the car to its limits. I didn't care where the road led anymore. I just needed to get the fuck out of there. But the road wouldn't let me go. It twisted and turned, winding through the endless fog, the trees growing denser, closer, until their branches scraped against the windows, leaving deep gouges in the glass. The figures were everywhere now, lining the road, their hollow eyes following me, their mouths moving in silent pleas. And then I saw the sign. It was old, the paint faded and chipped, barely readable through the fog. But as I sped past it, I caught a glimpse of the words, "Welcome to Hell." Fuck, I breathed, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The figures were gone, vanished into the fog, and the silence was deafening. I sat there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the road was empty, the fog thick and impenetrable, and the only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, wiping the sweat from my brow. "This isn't real. It's just a nightmare. You're going to wake up any second." But I didn't wake up. The road was still there, stretching out into the darkness, and I knew I had no choice but to keep going. I put the car in gear, my hands shaking, and started driving again, slower this time, the fog pressing in on all sides. The road seemed endless, winding through the dark, empty landscape, the silence oppressive. And then I saw it, the figure in the road. It was her again, the woman in the white dress, her hair hanging in dark, matted strands over her face. She was standing in the middle of the road, her arms outstretched, as if she were trying to stop me. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engine. "Please, help me!" I swerved to avoid her, the car lurching as it hit a pothole, but she didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes following me as I sped past her. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I knew deep down that if I pulled over, if I let her in, I'd never make it out. But as I drove on, the fog growing thicker, the road winding endlessly ahead, I could still hear her voice in my head, begging for help. The road went on for what felt like hours, the fog growing so thick that I could barely see a few feet ahead. The figures were everywhere now, lining the sides of the road, their hollow eyes staring at me, their mouths moving in silent screams. And then, up ahead, I saw the lights, faint at first, but growing brighter as I got closer. It was a gas station, old and run down, the neon sign flickering in the fog. The road led straight to it, the only break in the endless stretch of darkness. I pulled into the lot, the tires crunching on the gravel, and parked in front of the station. The building was old, the windows covered in grime, the paint peeling from the walls. But the lights were on, and there was a car parked around the side, its hood up, steam rising from the engine. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin, and made my way to the entrance. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the bell above it jangling weakly. The inside was as run down as the outside, the shelves half empty, the floor covered in a layer of dust. Behind the counter stood an old man, his face lined with wrinkles, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. "Help you?" he asked, his voice rough and raspy. I need directions," I stammered, my heart still racing from the drive. "I think I took a wrong turn somewhere." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. "You took the wrong road, son," he said finally, his voice low. "You shouldn't be here." "What do you mean?" I asked, my unease growing. "This road," he trailed off, shaking his head. "This road leads through hell itself. You're lucky to have made it this far." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "How do I get out?" I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed, looking down at the counter. You keep driving. Don't stop. Don't pull over, no matter what you see. And pray you make it to the other side." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. I didn't know if I believed him, didn't know if any of this was real, but I wasn't about to take any chances. "Thank you," I said, turning to leave. "Good luck," he called after me, his voice barely a whisper. I got back in the car, my hands still shaking as I started the engine. The road stretched out ahead of me, disappearing into the fog, but I knew I had no choice but to keep going. As I drove, the fog grew thicker, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The figures were back, lining the road, their hollow eyes watching me, their mouths moving in silent pleas, but I didn't stop. I kept driving, the road winding endlessly ahead, the figures growing more and more numerous with every mile. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the fog began to lift. The trees thinned out, the road straightening as it led out of the forest and into the open air. I breathed a sigh of relief as the night sky came into view, the stars twinkling above me like distant beacons. The road was still there, but the figures were gone, the fog dissipating into the cool night air. I kept driving, not daring to stop until I saw the familiar lights of the interstate up ahead. I pulled onto the highway, my heart finally beginning to slow as I left the nightmare behind. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her again. The woman in the white dress standing by the side of the road, her eyes locked onto mine. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how far I drove, no matter how fast I went, I'd never truly escape the road through hell.